Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. The desolate countryside of Minnesota seemed frozen in the night. The air was still, but something was missing. Perhaps the peace that should have been there had given way to an unsettling silence. The sky had hidden its stars, and even the moonlight seemed hesitant to fall on the dirt roads. Fields stretched out like an endless void, with thin layers of mist floating above the surface of the earth. It was nearing midnight. Brandon Swanson was returning from celebrating the end of the school year. He thought he knew the road well, but Minnesota's lonely trails turned into a different world after dark. Familiar paths disappeared, and the surroundings gave off a strange sense of emptiness. When he noticed the pavement end beneath his tires, it was too late. The steering wheel suddenly veered uncontrollably to the left. He felt the car drop into a hole. His body jolted, the seatbelt pressing against his chest. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the hum of the engine. The headlights illuminated the tall grass ahead and the traces of the road where the car had veered off. The car was stuck. Brandon took a deep breath, turned the wheel, and pressed the gas pedal. The tires spun in vain. He was wedged between the grass. That was when he first felt a strange sense of unease. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up. It was 11:30 p.m. He had no choice but to call his family. The phone began to ring. He waited and waited. Then a familiar, sleepy voice answered. "Dad, something's wrong. The car got stuck in a hole. Can you come get me?" His father answered, slightly confused. "All right, son, where are you?" Brandon stared into the darkness. The fields around him seemed endless, and he had no idea where the road led. He thought for a moment. The dark was a devouring thing. It was impossible to know what surrounded him. "I should be near Lind, but I'm not sure." His father told him to stay there, but Brandon wasn't at ease. Staying in the car only made the feeling that something unseen was watching him stronger. When he looked out the windshield, all he could see was an abyss of darkness, untouched by light. His family had set out, but no one knew that Brandon wouldn't be coming home that night. Brandon decided that staying in the car was pointless. The hum of the engine, the faint glow of the headlights, and the suffocating sense of loneliness gnawing at him had become unbearable. His phone was still pressed to his ear, and his father was telling him to wait there. But the unease inside him only grew. "I can't stay here, Dad. It's better if I walk toward the town lights." His father told him not to do that, but Brandon had already made up his mind. He opened the door, stepping into the cold and silence. Beyond the headlights, it was impossible to know what the darkness held. As he took his first step, he noticed the ground was unexpectedly soft. The earth was damp, and with each step, the mud lightly stuck to his shoes. The endless fields around him seemed vast and ominous, like a massive void. There were no houses, no cars, no street lamps, only endless darkness. He still held the phone, carefully keeping in touch with his family. His father's voice echoed through the speaker. "Can you see the light?" Brandon squinted into the dark. There was no light, only the faint moonlight seeping through thin layers of clouds above. "No, but I'm moving forward. The road seems to end here." The pavement had given way to dirt. With each step, he could hear the sound of crushed grass and snapping branches beneath his feet. But amid these sounds there was something else, a rustle. Was it just the wind? Or was something else moving? Brandon paused, holding his breath. Silence. But an unnatural silence. It was as if everything around him had frozen, waiting for him to make the next move. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He gripped the phone tighter. His father was still speaking to him, but his voice now seemed muffled and distant, as if coming from further away. Brandon paused again, making sure he heard nothing other than his own footsteps. And then, at that very moment, right behind him, a faint, indistinct footstep. Brandon spun around quickly. No one was there, but something was. In the shadows, by the side of the road, blending into the darkness, a figure. He squinted, trying to focus, but the figure was almost translucent. Was it a person, or just a shadow? Or was there something else watching him? As Brandon walked, his steps unconsciously quickened. The unease inside him was starting to overshadow his logic. Every now and then, he checked his phone, making sure the signal was still strong. His father's voice was still on the line, but something felt different. "Where are you? You shouldn't have gone too far, Brandon." Brandon swallowed and looked around. Something felt wrong. The night's darkness seemed to seep into him, filling his lungs. There was an invisible weight in the air, as if it was pulling him in. Then, he noticed something. The sound of water. It wasn't too far off. The Minnesota River. The moonlight glinted on the rippling water, a thin silver line across its surface. A gentle breeze stirred the branches of the trees. In that moment, for the first time, his skin prickled with fear. Because it wasn't just the sound of the wind. Something was moving behind Brandon, moving with him. A sound he couldn't quite distinguish. Footsteps that sounded like footsteps but somehow weren't. He listened more carefully. He stopped walking. And then, right behind him, he heard another rustling. Someone, or something, was walking with him. Brandon's breath quickened. He gripped the phone tighter. His instincts were screaming at him to walk faster. But the faster he moved, the faster the sound followed. Now it was unmistakable. Something was moving with him. Invisible, but real. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes, son? Are you okay?" Brandon swallowed. He didn't answer. He just kept moving forward. But now, he was almost at a run. His footsteps quickened, and the thing behind him, whatever it was, quickened with him. The rustling was no longer just a sound. It was a chill that spread through his entire body. From the other end of the phone, his father's worried voice came through. "Brandon, son, what's happening?" At that very moment, a shadow briefly appeared at the edge of his vision. Brandon whipped his head around, but there was nothing there. But there was something. His breath was ragged now. The river was so close. The moonlight danced on the water, but Brandon's eyes were no longer focused on the water. They were locked on what was behind him. He took one final step, and then he saw it. His brain struggled to process what he was seeing, but he couldn't stop his heart from pounding in his chest. Something pitch black, something unlike anything he knew. It only lasted for a few seconds, but those few seconds felt like an eternity. And then, oh shit. The phone fell to the ground. Then, the line went dead, and Brandon Swanson vanished into the night. When the call was cut off, time seemed to stop for a moment. Brian Swanson, frozen at the wheel, heard his son's voice tremble and then suddenly disappear. All that remained was a long, unsettling silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Brian suddenly, with trembling hands, dialed the number. Again. The phone rang, but no one answered. "Come on, Brandon. Pick up the phone." His wife, Anne, sat in the passenger seat, angrily staring at the phone screen. She too dialed the same number over and over again. But the result was always the same. The phone kept ringing, but there was no answer. Brian gripped the steering wheel tightly and pressed the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the headlights illuminated the road ahead. They drove toward the direction of the river, a voice inside telling them that Brandon must be somewhere nearby. But the night was eerily silent. As they approached, Brian slammed the car to a stop and jumped out. The phone was still in his hand, his shaking fingers dialing his son's number once more. "Brandon, can you hear me?" The wind answered with a faint whistling sound. The moonlight illuminated the dry grass on the ground. Brian squinted his eyes. He looked down at the surface of the earth from where he stood. There were no footprints. No footprints. No trace. Brandon had been here. He had heard his son's voice on the other end of the phone. But now, there was nothing left of him. Anne got out of the car and ran toward her husband. Her eyes were wide with worry. "Did you find him?" Brian, still with his eyes fixed on the ground, shook his head slowly. He was here. I heard his voice. In the night, a breathless silence hung in the air. The Minnesota River flowed slowly in the moonlight. The water was still. Even nature seemed frozen, as if it sensed that something was wrong. They searched until morning. They shouted. They called out. They wandered through the woods. But Brandon was nowhere to be found. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. By the time dawn arrived, the Swanson family was still standing in the same place. Their eyes were red, their breaths uneven, their bodies filled with chills. They had screamed Brandon's name all night, but the darkness of the night had not returned their son to them. With the first light of morning, the police arrived at the scene. The red and blue sirens disturbed the silence of the forest. The sky was gray, as though even nature itself was mourning the terrible loss of that day. The last signal cut off here. The police had tracked the last signal from Brandon's phone. The coordinates pointed to a spot very close to the river. But there was neither a trace nor a sign. Nothing. A void. The area where Brandon had disappeared was actually an ordinary field. It appeared to be nothing special, but the air carried a strange weight that words couldn't describe. The police began to search everywhere. Helicopters took off, drones scanned the area from above, and trained dogs followed the scent. But no matter how much they searched, the only thing they found was silence. No phone, no shoes, no piece of clothing. It was as if Brandon had never existed, gone without a trace. One of the police officers spoke into the radio frequency. Negative. Nothing. We're continuing the search. But they found nothing. For the search team, the most logical possibility was that Brandon had fallen into the river and drowned. Based on this theory, divers were immediately sent into the river. The water was freezing cold. As the first light of day reflected on the water's surface, the divers began to comb through the river step by step, dozens of minutes, hours of searching. But there was nothing at the bottom of the river, no trace. If Brandon had fallen into the water, where had his body gone? And most importantly, that final scream, the last panicked sound, the last words he whispered before the phone cut off that night. Oh shit! What had he seen? What had he encountered in that darkness? The search continued for days. Hundreds of people combed through miles of land, but no trace of Brandon was ever found. In the desolate roads of Minnesota, a young man had disappeared in one night, leaving behind unanswered questions. And the most terrifying thing, if he wasn't in the river, what happened to him that night? Years passed. The Minnesota River still flowed the same way. The fields swayed with the wind, and when night fell, the town was covered in an eerie silence. But something had changed. The townspeople had become more cautious about staying near the river at night. Some believed that the young man who had disappeared that night was still there. The area where Brandon Swanson had vanished became a terrifying legend over the years. Farmers, on some nights, when walking near the edge of their fields, would feel the presence of someone behind them. But when they turned around, no one was there. Some claimed that while driving along the road at midnight, they saw a shadow by the side of the road, a young man's silhouette, slightly bent, as if someone had stopped at the edge of the road trying to make their way home. But whenever anyone approached that shadow, it would vanish in the blink of an eye. One of the town's elders one afternoon told his grandchild a strange story. This road used to be safe, but now there's something here. The child asked curiously, "What's here, Grandpa?" The old man pursed his lips, the lines on, his face deepening. "When you walk by the river at night, sometimes you hear a sound." The child shivered. "What sound?" The old man squinted and whispered, "Footsteps." Then he added, "And sometimes a muffled whisper from the wind." The child gulped. "What does it say?" The old man broke the silence with that word, softly speaking. "Oh shit." And then Silence again.